So let's see. So this is specifically for IE. What do you recall life being like in Peoria in the 1960s as one of the 5 Chinese families in the city?
I would say it was very isolated. And because we had our restaurant, that was our whole life. They're just going to school and then coming back to the restaurant. So it was very nuclear. And we were always in competition with the other families, so we really didn't have that connection with them. And being the very few families in Peoria, you know, it was just so different. We were very isolated. My experience, you're talking about in the 60s.
Yeah, or like elementary school and middle school.
Yeah. Again, you know, I think that's a prevalent theme in terms of my own experience, was the isolation. Being one of only very few Chinese in my school, it was something that it's interesting. I always felt picked on. It was in 7th grade. We had the assignment of doing a study for countries, and there was a boy in the classes, and he took China, and so I helped him by giving him a lot of things that we had as for part of his report. And one day he says he laughed because, you know, there was always taunting of Ching Ching Chinaman. That was always there, and it always hurt, piercing very, very deeply. However, when he came to class one day and he says, "You Chinese eat rats," and I remember how that hurt so deeply, and I was shaking. And I had a wonderful teacher, and she said to me, because I was so shy and so meek, and I remember going up to her because I was so offended by that I said to her, you know, I was crying, and I said, "That's not true," because I had gone home and I talked to my mom, and she says, that's a stereotype. It's not true. And if that happened, it was during the wartime when food was scarce, and so, you know, that was a matter of survival. It wasn't a routine thing that Chinese eat rats. So I remember garnering up my strength and courage and going up to her, shaking and crying and saying, "That's not true," you know. And I remember she told me to go to the restroom to compose myself. And during that time period, she talked to the class, and she talked about the richness of China, and how, you know, we had, you know, the culture was there so much earlier than the United States, and all that we should be proud of, making paper and fireworks and ink, and, you know, all the things that we had to contribute. And so, and it was wrong for them to pick on me. And I'll always remember there's a very defining moment that I could say, hey, you know what, I can be proud. I don't have to prove myself. And so, and it was an awareness for the other kids too.
In the 1960s, we were starting to be teenagers then. And my experience was that we lived in the suburbs of LA, which was about, maybe about 10 miles away from Chinatown. Now, my dad grew up in Chinatown, but in the suburbs, we were pretty integrated. And so there were Black, Hispanic, Caucasian, there were a few Asians, but it was pretty integrated. But my dad's family lived in Chinatown, and they had a meat market, they had a restaurant. So we would go every weekend to the restaurant to be with our relatives. In the mid-60s was the Watts riots. And in the Watts riots, the neighborhood that we grew up in was predominantly Caucasian. It was middle class. During that time, we're on the border of some of the areas called Hancock Park, which a lot of the more well-to-do people lived. So, but the Watts riots changed everything. It turns out that it grew so fast in the Watts riots that where I grew up, the junior high school was actually the staging area for the northern border of Watts riots. So it changed a lot of what we saw back then. Now, typically in LA, the southern part of, it's called South Central LA, was where the blacks and Hispanics lived. So pushing it up to the area where they were, again, changed the dynamics up there. Were we marginalized? No, because no matter where we went, we were different. We were still a minority, be it Caucasian or be it black. I happened to be working in a supermarket, and in that supermarket there was an enclave of a lot of Asians. There was a bowling alley holiday bowl, and it was a lot of Asians, my generation, older generation. And then the supermarket that I worked at was largely an Asian clientele there. So we kind of fit right in. So as far as how you were treated, no matter where you went, you were different. You always heard your parents telling you have to act better, perform better, speak better, just to be equal. And you didn't know what that meant, at least not as a teenager, in the 70s and the late 60s, 70s. So you had the Democratic riots that were in Chicago. So people became much more vocal. From the Watts riots, people became much more vocal. But as I was going through school during the early 70s, I was trying to get into dental school. And in part of the competition, you didn't want to look different or act different. Again, it was just about how you performed. So I didn't get involved. Whenever anything like that happened on campus, I went to UCLA, and there were lots of demonstrations on campus. I stayed away because it could have hurt my chances, I thought, at that time, of getting into professional school. Was I aware of it? Yes. During that time, there were Asian American clubs that were starting, and a lot of the thrust of the clubs were about how difficult it was to get into the UC systems, and how they were quotas, sometimes implied quotas but not stated quotas, and the same thing for going into professional school. The school that I went to was Georgetown. And Georgetown it's one of the oldest dental schools in the country, started in 1789. And when I got into that school, there were 3 other schools that I got into, but Georgetown had its first non-Caucasian, non-Catholic, non-males, only 2 classes ahead of me. And this was in 1973. So, and in our class of 140, there were 7 of us. We found out through informal pathways we were considered minorities, and that's how they got funding for the schools, federal funding. Now, did we benefit by that? Well, we didn't benefit by getting any grants, but technically we probably benefited by being admitted there, because we weren't considered minorities in California. So in that transition, it was tougher to get into California for Asian. I don't know. I don't have the experience. I don't have the statistics to see that. Again, it's going back to where there were implied quotas for the UC schools. As we move forward, though, and some of the experiences in Washington, we were adopted by some Asian families that were out there, and they got into dental schools in the late 60s, early 70s, and they would tell us stories about how when they first got into the Dunham schools back there, and it was Howard at the time, which was a black university, that they didn't know with going with their friends in Washington, D.C., whether or not they should go to the white only or the black only side. And there were still areas in Washington that had that. So there was confusion of who you were at the time. And you'd hear the same stories from them. They had to act better, perform better, be in the straight and narrow. Otherwise, there would be some subtle racism. And the racism would be where they had expectations, teachers, professors had expectations, where they thought we should perform better, and it would be really subtle in the beginning. Some of the other things that you started to see was that we'd go to the store, and as we talked to people there, or even the clerks, they would say, "You speak English so well, how long have you been in this country?" And they would have maybe a southern accent, who was difficult to understand them. But then they had an assumption that we were foreign born.
So do you want to talk about your experience with Yellow Power? Or
Yeah, well, so I was at the University of Illinois, and it was a dynamic time in that Kent State had just happened. We had, popular black authors. Soul on Ice was one that started. All of a sudden, there was an awareness, an ability to say, "Hey, we are somebody other than just being the suppressed minority." And so, with the advent of Black Power and the Vietnam War and Kent State and people saying, it was a time of unrest, and certainly for myself. I was one of the people that started the Asian American Alliance, AAA, at the University of Illinois. This awareness of Asian power, Yellow Power, was percolating throughout, well, not throughout, on the West Coast here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and then in New York. But in the Midwest, it was sort of, because there were so few, in terms of percentage of population, it was primarily in Chicago. But at the University of Illinois, where a lot of native Chicagoans had gone to go to school, came together and found a voice. And we protested the wars, and there with our protest signs and contributing and being a part of that movement, whereas before, as the obedient Asian, don't rock the boat, study hard, and succeed, but not have a social conscience so much, changed. And I think, as a group, as we got together and we found our voice and found that we could make a difference, then we started to fight for some things that were missing within the curriculum. So all of a sudden, there was Asian studies classes that were being held, and then we started to ask for cultural events that were Asian based, or to find learn more about our heritage. And so it was a time of unity, and so I think we found our voice. We were able to protest. We could say that we are more than just some secondary minority that was really didn't do anything to rock the boat. So yeah, it was a dynamic time, and very interesting.
This is kind of riding on the Yellow Power movement question, but when did you feel, or did you ever feel that you had to make that distinction between Chinese American or American born Chinese versus Asian American, and when did that distinction arise for you?
Well, I'll say that at the University of Illinois, with our AAA, the majority of people were either Chinese or Japanese. And there were not as many other Asian groups. The Filipinos, Korean, Vietnamese were not really, because they weren't there weren't as many just in terms of population. So I think that for my own, it was Chinese American and Japanese American. And later on, to be more inclusive, realizing as certainly as more ethnic groups came on campus, that together there was greater strength in numbers than it was to be segregated. And so the term Asian Pacific Islander evolved. And so Asian studies encompassed more than just China or Japanese, but then began to have classes for all the other ethnic groups. When did that happen? I think as more of the different Asian groups became part of the population. When I came out to California and saw the tremendous diversity of so many Asian ethnicities, I think that increased my own personal awareness, because I didn't have exposure to those. I mean, very few, maybe just one Korean. I knew quite a few Filipinos in Peoria that went to our restaurant, but and then to include Indo-Americans as well. So it's become more encompassing, and yet now there's a trend now to sort of find strength in your own ethnic group, and so people are starting to actually subgroups within the API community. Okay, so from my perspective, being first generation born here, identify with the term Chinese American. We also grew up with the term ABC, American Born Chinese. But I think that because first generation born here, our family environment was that we were Chinese. And I think that that's where my personal identification is, with being Chinese American. But a nice blend of East and West, embracing the best of both cultures, I think. When I was growing up, there was no Chinese American. You were pigeonholed into, you were Chinese. Mm-hmm. And so that was the role you took on. But that was what I identified with. They didn't say Chinese American. And it wasn't until I got to college where we started talking about ABCs. So, but that's evolved. I think that's...
Well, but then I grew up in the West Coast, so the experience is different too.
Right.
So, typically when you hear and you think of Black Power, it's a very belligerent, very vocal, very angry type of angst against the subordination of the majority population. Yellow Power, I'm not sure what that means. I mean, I didn't experience it, I didn't see it when I was going through school. But it seemed like you were trying to imitate the blacks in that, but it didn't work. It was more subtle, and as an overriding behavior, you still have to compete with them. You still have to, meaning the majority population, you had to perform better, act better, and be very, very mainstream in order to compete with them. So having this strident, bellicose attitude in public, we still had that as we were going through in the 60s, because you're still teenagers, you're still uncertain of yourself, let alone your ethnicity. But again, because of my drive to become get into dental school, I had to subordinate a lot of that.
Did you feel like you were treated any different during the Vietnam War, because it was a war that was happening in Asia and everything, or in Vietnam? Do you remember being treated differently? Do you remember obviously like campus protests and things, but
in general, I think anyone who was Asian looking was treated differently, and it was accentuated because of the war. But this was the first war that the awareness of what war is all about. This is why, because of the news, every night, you saw film footage, which previous wars they didn't have that. The technology was such that within a couple of days you could see what war was all about. And I think that raised the awareness of war Did we feel that we had to identify ourselves and say, hey, we're not Vietnamese? I didn't have to do that. I didn't feel ever having to do that. I think that because of the isolation, well, not isolation, but the community on a college campus, we were protesting it more than to say, oh, we're not, you're not. I don't think we felt. I didn't feel discriminated against, thinking that because I was Asian that I had to defend myself and explain that I'm not Vietnamese.
UCLA is much more integrated. Remember, it's the West Coast. There's many more Asians there, and it's so isolated. So if it's the interplay of being Asian, being identified, and being called names, you're in a very, very isolated cluster. It didn't come into play at UCLA, not that I was aware of. Again, because of my academic background, you stayed away from it anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a different environment.